Welcome to UFY. I'm your host, Brian DeRocher. You know, a lot of attention has been directed towards the recent overturning of Proposition 8, primarily focused around Supreme Court Judge Vaughn Walker's decision being biased because, after all, he's gay. Quoting a story from the Daily Sentinel, the proponents of Proposition 8 did not object to Judge Walker's assignment to the case on the basis of his sexual orientation when they had an opportunity to do so. They believed he had demonstrated a record of integrity and impartiality, even in cases involving homosexuals. Rather, Judge Walker himself should have made the decision to recuse. Canon 2 of the Code of Conduct for United States Judges, the ethics ruling governing Supreme Court judges, states that a judge should avoid impropriety and the appearance of impropriety in all activities. End quote. Now that means by this logic, Sotomayor can't sit in on Spanish issues, and then the newly appointed Elena Kagan can't sit in on fat Jewish lesbian issues. Now, the uproar against Walker has gone to the point that a guy by the name of Byron Fisher, he's the issues director for the American Families Association, has urged the group members to write their representatives to start impeachment proceedings against Walker. Impeachment proceedings against Walker. You have got to be kidding me. Only reason people are so upset now is because they have to openly admit that homosexuality is a real thing, and then when they see a gay person on the side of the road or out in a park or out in the mall, that they're living a happy, normal lifestyle, and that the gay colloquialism that we all think that we know is not a person who's going to run around eating your firstborn son and having sex in groups of 10 to 12 outside nurseries and elementary schools. I'm going to read now from the actual text of the ruling. It's about 3 paragraphs long, which I think a lot of people should do is read this actual ruling. I don't mean read a few sentences and think you know what you're talking about. I mean download the entire thing and read the entire thing. If you're going to argue it, you need to read what his motives were and what his actual words were when he did this. Here we go. Plaintiffs and proponents presented expert testimony on the meaning of marriage. Historian Nancy Cott testified about the public institution of marriage and the state's interest in recognizing and regulating marriages. She explained that marriage is a couple's choice to live with each other, to remain committed to one another, and to form a household based on their own feelings about one another and their agreement to join in an economic partnership and support one another in terms of material needs of life. The state's primary purpose in regulating marriage is to create stable households. Think tank founder David Blankenhorn testified that marriage is a socially approved sexual relationship between a man and a woman, with a primary purpose to regulate filiation. Blankenhorn testified that others hold to an alternative and, to him, conflicting definition of marriage, a private adult commitment that focuses on the tender feelings that the spouses have for one another. So Blankenhorn is flat out saying that marriage is a relationship between a man and a woman in which they reproduce and has nothing to do with love or anything like that. To Blankenhorn, marriage is either a socially approved sexual relationship between a man and a woman for the purpose of bearing and raising children who are biologically related to both spouses, or a private relationship between two consenting adults. Cott explained that marriage as a social institution encompasses a socially approved sexual union and an effective relationship and, for the state, forms a basis of stable households and private support obligations. Both Cott and Blankenhorn addressed marriage as a historical institution. Here's where it gets weird. Cott pointed to consistent historical features of marriage, including that civil law as opposed to religious custom have always been supreme in regulating and defining marriage in the United States, and that one's ability to consent to marriage is a basic civil right. Now, Blankenhorn identified 3 rules of marriage. This is the weird part, which he testified had been consistent across cultures and times. Number 1, the rule of opposites, which is the man and woman rule. Number 2, the rule of twos, only 2 people can be wed, which if you look through the history, especially of, Mormonism, that thing is pretty much out the window. And his third and final rule is the rule of sex. Cott identified historical changes in the institution of marriage, including removal of race restrictions through court decisions and the elimination of coverture and other gender-based distinctions. Blankenhorn identified changes that to him signify the deinstitutionalization of marriage, including things like increase in births outside of marriage and an increase in divorce rate. Now, both Cott and Blankenhorn testified that California stands to benefit if it were to resume issuing marriage licenses to same-sex couples. Blankenhorn noted that marriage would benefit same-sex couples and their children, would reduce discrimination against gays and lesbians, and would be, quote, a victory for the worthy ideas of tolerance and inclusion. Now, despite the multitude of benefits identified by Blankenhorn that would flow to the state, to gays and lesbians, and to American ideals were California to recognize same-sex marriage, Blankenhorn testified that the state should not recognize same-sex marriage. He said his reasonings were that the benefits of same-sex marriage are not valuable enough because same-sex marriage can conceivably weaken marriage as an institution. Cott testified that the state would benefit from recognizing same-sex marriage because such marriages would provide, quote, another resource for stability and social order. Psychologist Letitia Ann Peplau testified that couples benefit both physically and economically when they are married. Peplau testified that those benefits would accrue to same-sex as opposite-sex married couples. To Peplau, the desire of same-sex couples to marry illustrates the health of the institution of marriage and not, as Blankenhorn testified, the weakening of marriage. Economist Lee Badgett provided evidence that same-sex couples would benefit economically if they were able to marry, and that same-sex marriages would have no adverse effect on the institution of marriage or on opposite-sex couples. As explained in the credibility determinations, the court finds the testimony of Cott, Peplau, and Badgett to support findings on the definition and purpose of civil marriage. The testimony of Blankenhorn is unreliable. The trial evidence provides no basis for establishing that California has an interest in refusing to recognize marriage between two people because of their sex. End quote. Fact of the matter is that allowing the same-sex people to marry will have absolutely no effect on anyone else but them, and all it's going to be is good effects. It's going to be good financially and emotionally for them. They're not going to reproduce and take over the world. They're not going to eat you and kill your babies. So we have two arguments here, two major arguments that I can see from the text. One of them is that gay marriage violates the sanctity or the institution of marriage. And the second one is that letting gays marry is going to violate the definition of marriage. So for number one, gay marriage violating the sanctity of marriage, what about things like, I don't know, divorce? What about common law marriage? Are we not going to recognize divorce now because it violates the sanctity of marriage? Because if you get divorced now, you're not going to be, you're not going to have a mom and dad raising the kid. You're just going to have mom or dad or whoever has custody. Wouldn't it be more beneficial to have two parental figures than one, regardless of gender? Now for number two, that it violates the definition of marriage. Take a bite out of this. Webster's dictionary defines the word marriage as the state of being united to a person of the opposite sex as husband or wife in a consensual and contractual relationship recognized by law. Now, surely there's no religious reasons for it to say a person of the opposite sex, right? I mean, why would Webster have any religious influences in his text? Well, as it turns out, Noah Webster, was a self-proclaimed free thinker until just after the turn of the 19th century, when he decided to convert to Calvinistic orthodoxy and become a devout Congregationalist, authoritarian, and elitist who preached the need to Christianize the entire nation. Webster viewed language as a tool to control unruly thoughts. His American Dictionary emphasized the virtues of social control over human passions and individualism, submission to authority, and most importantly, fear of God. Webster was a devoutly religious man, as were most of the people of that time. It wasn't until the obviously pagan and devil-worshipping idea of science and technology came about that people started to actively pursue other methods of a moral compass than the Bible. Proponents of Proposition 8 are afraid that the definition of marriage is going to say between two people as opposed to saying between a man and a woman. It's that simple. I don't even know what they're afraid of. It's not like they're going to create the Married Man and Webster's dictionary and make the definition of marriage to read a bond between either a man and a woman and a man, a woman and a woman, a she-man and a man, a woman and a she-man, or the bi-curious courting of the young boys from the movie Twilight. Proposition 8 was unconstitutional in the first place. It's the job of Supreme Court judges to ensure that laws like this, regardless of who votes on it and why, are not passed. This should never have been in legislation at all, because at the end of the day, it's a violation of basic civil liberties. Everyone is entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Everyone has the liberty to pursue happiness in their own life however they choose. It's not our job to judge one another. You know what? As a matter of fact, it's not our job to judge one another. I know I've heard that before. That's right. Book of James, chapter 4, verse 12. Opposing team, UFY.